Imagine making a cold-hearted bet to marry a homeless woman, only to find yourself falling deeply in love and transforming not just your life, but an entire community. Picture a man who thought he had everything, realizing he had nothing until he opened his heart to someone society had cast aside. What if the cruelest game you ever played became the most beautiful love story ever told? This is the journey of Dylan and Morgan Morissette, a tale of redemption, second chances, and the power of love to change lives. From the glittering heights of corporate America to the gritty streets of Detroit, their story will take you on an emotional roller coaster filled with unexpected twists and heartwarming triumphs. Stay until the end and be amazed by this breathtaking narrative that proves sometimes the greatest risk we can take is opening our hearts to love. Hearts to love. The Detroit skyline loomed large and imposing against the steel-gray sky, a testament to both the city's industrial past and its uncertain future. Among the towering skyscrapers and revitalized neighborhoods, one building stood out, a gleaming monument to success and excess. This was the headquarters of Morissette Enterprises, and at its very top, in an office larger than most homes, sat Dylan Morissette. At 38, Dylan was the epitome of the American dream, or perhaps its darkest perversion. His steely blue eyes scanned the city below, a kingdom he felt he'd conquered through sheer will and cunning. Every inch of him exuded power, from his impeccably tailored suit to his meticulously groomed salt and pepper hair. Yet beneath this polished exterior lurked a coldness that even his closest associates found unsettling. "Another day, another dollar," Dylan muttered to himself, a sardonic smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He turned from the window, his Italian leather shoes silent on the plush carpet as he made his way to his desk. The surface was bare save for a single photograph face down in a silver frame, a relic from a past he refused to acknowledge. A soft knock at the door broke his reverie. "Mr. Morissette, your 2 o'clock is here." His assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Send them in," Dylan replied, his voice clipped and devoid of emotion. The door opened and in walked 3 men, each as impeccably dressed as Dylan himself. These were his inner circle, the only people he might consider friends if he believed in such a concept. "Gentlemen," Dylan greeted them, gesturing to the leather chairs in front of his desk. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" The men exchanged glances, a mix of anticipation and something darker in their eyes. It was Bradley, the boldest of the 3, who spoke first. "Dylan, old friend, we've come to propose a little wager," Bradley said, a mischievous glint in his eye. Dylan's eyebrow arched slightly, the only indication of his interest. "A wager? And here I thought we'd exhausted all possible bets in our illustrious careers." The men chuckled, a sound as hollow as their moral compasses. "Oh, this one's different," chimed in Richard, leaning forward. "We've been watching you, Dylan. You've conquered every challenge thrown your way. Business, real estate, even politics. But there's one frontier you've yet to explore. And what might that be?" Dylan asked, his voice tinged with boredom. "Love," said the third man, Marcus, almost spitting out the word. "Or rather, marriage." Dylan's face remained impassive, but inside a storm was brewing. Marriage. The very word brought back memories he'd long suppressed, memories of betrayal and loss. Bradley, sensing Dylan's hesitation, pressed on. "Not just any marriage, mind you. We propose a union of true opposites. You, Dylan Morissette, titan of industry, and a woman from the streets." The room fell silent, the proposition hanging in the air like a guillotine blade. Dylan's mind raced, calculations and possibilities flashing through his thoughts at lightning speed. "Interesting," he finally said, leaning back in his chair. "And the terms?" The men grinned, knowing they had him hooked. 1 year, Richard explained. "Marry her, live with her, make it look real to the world. If you can do it without falling for her or calling it quits, we'll each give you 20% of our companies." Dylan's eyes widened fractionally. The stakes were enormous, potentially doubling his already vast empire. But more than that, it was the challenge that called to him, the chance to prove once and for all that he was above such petty emotions as love. "And if I lose?" he asked, though in his mind, failure wasn't an option. "Then you owe us the same," Marcus said. 20% of Morissette Enterprises to each of us." Dylan stood, walking back to the window. The city sprawled before him, a concrete jungle full of people living their small, emotional lives. He'd always seen himself as above them, beyond the reach of human frailty. This bet would prove it once and for all. "Gentlemen," he said, turning back to face them, a predatory smile on his face, "you have yourselves a wager." The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Dylan's team, sworn to secrecy, scoured the streets of Detroit for the perfect candidate. They found her in a homeless shelter on the outskirts of the city, Morgan Wells, 32, with a haunted look in her eyes that spoke of a hard life lived. Dylan observed her from afar, noting her threadbare clothes and the way she flinched at sudden movements. Perfect, he thought, a broken bird, easy to manipulate and discard when the year was up. The proposal, if one could call it that, was as cold and transactional as a business merger. Dylan approached Morgan outside the shelter, his presence drawing stares from the other residents. "Morgan Wells?" he asked, though he knew full well who she was. She looked up at him, suspicion evident in her gaze. "Who's asking?" "Dylan Morissette. I have a proposition for you." He laid out the terms clinically: marriage, a year of comfort and luxury, and a substantial payout at the end. What he didn't mention was the bet, the cruel game of which she was an unwitting pawn. Morgan listened, her face a mask of disbelief and wary hope. "Why me?" she finally asked. Dylan's lie came smoothly, practiced. "Consider it a social experiment, a chance to prove that anyone can rise above their circumstances." Morgan's eyes hardened, a flicker of something, pride perhaps, or determination, shining through. "And what makes you think I want to rise above my circumstances on your terms?" For a moment, Dylan was taken aback. He hadn't expected resistance, hadn't considered that this woman might have a spine beneath her ragged exterior. It only steeled his resolve. "The terms are simple," he said, his voice cold. "Take the offer or leave it. But consider this your only chance to ever see the inside of a home again." The words hung between them, harsh and cruel. Morgan flinched as if struck, but then straightened, meeting Dylan's gaze with a fire he hadn't anticipated. "Fine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do it. But not for you, and not for your money. I'll do it to prove that people like you don't get to decide the worth of people like me." Dylan smiled, a gesture devoid of warmth. "Then we have a deal, Miss Wells. Or should I say, the future Mrs. Morissette." The wedding, held just days later, was a spectacle that set Detroit's high society abuzz. The cream of the city's elite gathered in the ornate cathedral, their whispers a constant undercurrent as they waited for the bride. Dylan stood at the altar, every inch the successful groom in his bespoke tuxedo, but his eyes were cold, scanning the crowd with a look of smug satisfaction. This was just another victory to him, another conquered challenge. The music swelled, and all heads turned as Morgan began her walk down the aisle. The transformation was startling. Gone were the ragged clothes and untamed hair. In their place was a vision in white, a designer gown hugging curves no one knew she possessed. Her hair was swept up elegantly, her makeup flawless, but it was her eyes that caught everyone's attention. Where they expected to see awe or gratitude, there was only steely determination. Morgan walked with her head high, ignoring the whispers and stares. Each step was deliberate, a silent declaration of her strength. As she reached Dylan, their eyes met. In that moment, something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of the battle of wills that was to come. Dylan's smirk faltered for just a second before he regained his composure. The ceremony was brief and loveless. They exchanged rings and vows with all the warmth of a business transaction. When the priest pronounced them man and wife, the kiss they shared was perfunctory, a mere brushing of lips that left both feeling oddly unsettled. The reception that followed was a study in contrasts. The opulence of the venue clashed harshly with the underlying current of discomfort. Dylan's friends watched with barely concealed amusement, while the other guests oscillated between morbid curiosity and outright disdain. Morgan, for her part, navigated the evening with surprising grace. She accepted congratulations with quiet dignity, her responses measured and polite, but those who looked closely could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes. As the night wore on, Dylan found himself watching his new bride from across the room. He noticed the way she flinched almost imperceptibly when people touched her, the careful way she held herself apart from the crowd. For the first time, he wondered about the story behind those reactions, the life that had shaped this woman he'd so casually decided to use. The thought was fleeting, quickly buried under layers of cynicism and self-interest. This was a game, he reminded himself. Nothing more. As the reception wound down, Dylan approached Morgan, offering his arm with exaggerated gallantry. "Shall we, Mrs. Morissette?" he asked, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Your new home awaits." Morgan took his arm, her touch light but her grip firm. "Lead the way, Mr. Morissette," she replied, her voice steady despite the apprehension in her eyes. They left amid a flurry of rice and half-hearted cheers, climbing into the waiting limousine. As soon as the door closed, shutting out the world, the facade dropped. They sat on opposite sides of the car, the space between them a chasm of unspoken words and hidden agendas. The drive to Dylan's mansion was silent, the city lights flashing by unnoticed. Morgan stared out the window, her reflection in the glass a ghostly reminder of the life she'd left behind. Dylan watched her surreptitiously, trying to gauge what challenges she might present to his plan. Finally, the car pulled up to a set of imposing iron gates. As they swung open, Morgan's eyes widened at the sight before her. The Morissette mansion loomed large, a sprawling estate that seemed to touch the night sky. Manicured lawns stretched as far as the eye could see, broken only by the winding driveway that led to the main house. As they pulled up to the entrance, Morgan's breath caught in her throat. This was to be her home for the next year, a palace compared to the streets she'd known. But as she looked at the cold stone facade, she couldn't help but wonder if she'd traded one prison for another. Dylan stepped out first, not bothering to offer her assistance. Morgan followed, her wedding dress rustling as she emerged from the car. She stood for a moment, taking in the sheer magnitude of her new surroundings. "Welcome home," Dylan said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I hope you'll find it comfortable." Morgan turned to him, her eyes meeting his with unexpected intensity. "Thank you," she said simply, but the words carried weight. It was a challenge, a declaration that she wouldn't be cowed by his wealth or his disdain. As they climbed the steps to the front door, Morgan's hand trailed along the stone railing. The cool, smooth surface grounded her, a reminder that this was real, not some fever dream born of desperation. The massive oak door swung open, revealing a foyer larger than any room Morgan had ever lived in. Crystal chandeliers cast a soft glow over marble floors and priceless artwork. It was beautiful, overwhelming and utterly foreign. Dylan watched Morgan's reaction closely, expecting to see awe or greed. Instead, he saw something that unsettled him, a quiet resilience, a determination that seemed at odds with the broken woman he'd expected to manipulate. "Your room is upstairs," he said brusquely, already turning away. "I'm sure you can find it. The staff will assist you with anything you need." He began to walk away, but Morgan's voice stopped him. "Dylan," she said, and something in her tone made him turn back. She stood there, a vision in white against the opulent backdrop, her eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "I know what this is," she said softly. "I know I'm here as part of some game you're playing, but I want you to know something." She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I'm not a toy, and I'm not broken. Whatever you think this year will be, I promise you, it won't go the way you expect." With that, she turned and climbed the grand staircase, leaving Dylan standing in the foyer, an unfamiliar feeling of unease settling in his stomach. As he watched her disappear into the upper reaches of the mansion, he couldn't shake the sense that he'd underestimated Morgan Wells. The game, it seemed, had only just begun. The first rays of dawn crept through the ornate curtains of Morgan's new bedroom, rousing her from a fitful sleep. For a moment, disorientation gripped her as she took in the luxurious surroundings, a far cry from the shelters and alleyways she'd called home for so long. Reality settled in slowly, bringing with it a mix of trepidation and resolve. This was her life now, at least for the next year, and she was determined to face it head-on. Morgan rose, her bare feet sinking into the plush carpet. She made her way to the ensuite bathroom, larger than any apartment she'd ever lived in. As she caught her reflection in the mirror, she hardly recognized herself. Gone was the street-hardened woman. In her place stood someone who looked almost fragile. Morgan squared her shoulders, steeling herself. She was many things, but fragile wasn't one of them. Downstairs, the mansion hummed with quiet activity. Staff moved efficiently through the halls, preparing for the day ahead. Among them was Mrs. Hawkins, the stern-faced housekeeper who'd been with the Morissette family for decades. Her eyes narrowed as she saw Morgan descending the stairs, dressed in simple jeans and a t-shirt, clothes that had been provided for her, but a far cry from what Mrs. Hawkins deemed appropriate for the lady of the house. "Good morning, Mrs. Morissette," Mrs. Hawkins said, her tone clipped. "Breakfast is served in the morning room. Mr. Morissette has already left for the office." Morgan nodded, trying to ignore the judgment in the housekeeper's eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Hawkins, and please call me Morgan." Mrs. Hawkins' lips thinned. "That wouldn't be appropriate, madam. Now, if you'll follow me." As they walked, Morgan couldn't help but feel the weight of the staff's stares. Whispers followed in her wake, speculation about her past, her motives, her worthiness to be in this house. She held her head high, refusing to be cowed. She'd faced worse on the streets. In the morning room, a spread fit for royalty awaited. Morgan hesitated, overwhelmed by the choices. Mrs. Hawkins watched, a hint of impatience in her stance. "Is something wrong with the selection, Mrs. Morissette?" she asked. Morgan took a deep breath. "No, it's fine. I'm just not used to all this." For a moment, something like sympathy flashed in Mrs. Hawkins' eyes, quickly replaced by her usual stern expression. "Well, you'd best get used to it. Mr. Morissette expects things to be done a certain way in this house." As Morgan ate, she couldn't help but feel like an intruder in her own home. The weight of expectations, from Dylan, from the staff, from society, pressed down on her. But with each bite, she felt her determination grow. She'd survived on the streets, she could survive this gilded cage. Meanwhile, across town, Dylan Morissette strode into the gleaming offices of Morissette Enterprises. Employees scattered in his wake, their good mornings met with curt nods at best. In the elevator, Dylan allowed himself a moment of reflection. The previous night played through his mind. Morgan's unexpected strength, the way she'd looked at him with defiance rather than gratitude. He pushed the thoughts aside. This was just another challenge to overcome, nothing more. The elevator doors opened directly into Dylan's executive suite. His assistant, Sarah, greeted him with a stack of files and a steaming cup of coffee. "Morning, Mr. Morissette. Your 9 a.m. with the board has been moved up to 8:30. Also, Mr. Vega called again about the merger. He's getting impatient." Dylan took the coffee, his mind already shifting into business mode. "Tell Vega he'll get the terms when I'm good and ready. And Sarah, I don't want any calls about my personal situation. Is that clear?" Sarah nodded, used to Dylan's brusque manner. "Crystal clear, sir." As Dylan settled into his morning routine across town, one of his closest associates was having a very different start to his day. Arnaldo Russo, CFO of Morissette Enterprises, sat in his home office, sweat beading on his brow despite the cool air conditioning. Arnaldo stared at his computer screen, the numbers before him telling a story he'd been desperately trying to hide. For months he'd been siphoning funds from the company, covering his tracks with increasingly complex financial maneuvers. But now, with the Vega merger looming, the house of cards was threatening to collapse. His phone buzzed, a text from Dylan about the morning's board meeting. Arnaldo's hand shook as he replied, assuring his boss that everything was in order. He'd find a way out of this mess. He had to. Back at the mansion, Morgan had decided to explore her new home. Each room told a story of wealth and privilege, but also of a strange emptiness. There were no family photos, no personal touches. It was as if the house were a showroom rather than a home. In the library, Morgan's attention was drawn to a small, ornate box on one of the shelves. Curiosity got the better of her, and she opened it. Inside was a photograph, worn and creased, as if it had been handled many times. It showed a younger Dylan, smiling genuinely, his arm around a beautiful woman. Morgan's breath caught. The happiness in Dylan's eyes was so at odds with the man she'd met. "What are you doing in here?" The sharp voice made Morgan jump. She turned to see Mrs. Hawkins in the doorway, her expression thunderous. "I'm sorry. I was just—" "This room is off limits," Mrs. Hawkins interrupted, striding forward to snatch the box from Morgan's hands. "Mr. Morissette values his privacy." As Mrs. Hawkins ushered her out, Morgan couldn't shake the image of that photograph. Who was that woman? And what had happened to turn the smiling young man into the cold, calculating Dylan she knew? The days that followed fell into an uneasy routine. Morgan tried to find her place in the mansion, but at every turn, she felt the weight of judgment and expectation. The staff, while never openly hostile, maintained a cool distance. All except for Jack, the groundskeeper, a gruff man in his 60s who seemed immune to the gossip surrounding Morgan's arrival. One afternoon, as Morgan wandered the vast gardens, She came across Jack tending to a bed of roses. He glanced up at her approach, offering a nod of acknowledgement. "Afternoon, Mrs. Morissette. Enjoying the gardens?" Morgan smiled, grateful for the lack of judgment in his tone. "Please call me Morgan. And yes, they're beautiful. I've never seen anything like them." Jack stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "Been tending these gardens for 30 years. Seen a lot of changes in this house, but these roses, they stay the same. Constant, you know." Morgan nodded, sensing a depth to his words. Have you worked for the Morissettes all that time?" Jack's eyes took on a distant look. "I worked for Dylan's father first. Now there was a man who knew the value of things beyond money." He paused, seeming to catch himself. "But that's not my place to say. You need anything while you're out here, Mrs. Morgan?" Morgan shook her head, touched by the small kindness. "No, thank you, Jack. I appreciate the company." As Jack returned to his work, Morgan couldn't help but wonder about the history he'd hinted at. What had shaped Dylan into the man he was today? That evening, Dylan returned home earlier than usual. The house was quiet, the staff having retired for the night. He made his way to his study, a tumbler of scotch in hand, his mind still churning with the day's business dealings. The Vega merger was proving more complicated than anticipated, and there was something off about the latest financial reports from Arnaldo's department. As he approached his study, he was surprised to see light spilling from under the door. Irritation flared. He'd made it clear that this was his private space. He pushed the door open, ready to berate whoever had intruded. The words died on his lips as he saw Morgan, curled up in one of the leather armchairs, a book open on her lap. She looked up at his entrance, surprise and then wariness crossing her features. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, moving to stand. "I didn't think you'd be home so early. I wanted something to read." Dylan's eyes narrowed, taking in the scene. The book in her hands was a first edition Hemingway, valuable but not something he'd expect someone from her background to appreciate. "You read Hemingway?" he asked, unable to keep the skepticism from his voice. Morgan's chin lifted slightly, a now familiar defiance in her eyes. "I may not have had much, but libraries are free. Is it so hard to believe that someone like me might enjoy literature?" The statement hung between them, a challenge and a revelation. Dylan found himself reassessing the woman before him, seeing glimpses of depths he hadn't anticipated. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed insistently. Glancing at the screen, he saw Arnaldo's name. With a curt nod to Morgan, he stepped back into the hallway to take the call. "Arnaldo, this better be important." Arnaldo's voice came through, tense and hurried. "Dylan, we have a problem. The audit team, they're asking questions about the offshore accounts. I don't think I can handle it." Dylan cut him off, his voice low and dangerous. "Whatever it takes, Arnaldo. I don't care how you do it. But make sure those questions stop. Understood?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Understood," Arnaldo finally replied, his voice barely above a whisper. As Dylan ended the call, he became aware of a presence behind him. He turned to find Morgan standing in the doorway of the study, an unreadable expression on her face. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. Dylan's face hardened, the mask of indifference slipping firmly back into place. "Everything's fine. Not that it's any of your concern." He brushed past her, entering the study and making his way to the desk. Morgan lingered in the doorway, watching as he poured himself another drink. "You know," she said softly, "I may not understand the world of high finance, but I do know what desperation sounds like. And your friend?" He sounded desperate. Dylan's head snapped up, his eyes meeting hers with a mixture of anger and something else, surprise perhaps, at her perceptiveness. "You don't know anything about my business or my associates," he said, his voice cold. "I'd suggest you stick to your novels and leave matters you don't understand alone." Morgan held his gaze for a long moment before nodding slowly. "As you wish, Mr. Morissette. Good night." As she turned to leave, Dylan found himself speaking again, almost against his will. "Morgan," she paused, looking back at him. "The book. You can borrow it if you'd like. Just be careful with it." A small smile touched Morgan's lips, the first genuine one he'd seen from her. "Thank you, I will." As she left, closing the door behind her, Dylan sank into his chair. He stared at the space she'd occupied, a tumult of thoughts and emotions he couldn't quite name swirling inside him. For the first time since this arrangement began, he felt off balance, unsure. In her room, Morgan carefully placed the Hemingway on her nightstand. She ran her fingers over the worn cover, her mind replaying the interaction with Dylan. There had been a moment there, brief but unmistakable, when the mask had slipped. She'd seen something in his eyes, a vulnerability perhaps, or a hint of the man in that old photograph. As she prepared for bed, Morgan couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The carefully constructed walls between them had cracked, ever so slightly. And in those cracks, the seeds of change had begun to take root. Little did either of them know that this small moment, a borrowed book, a moment of unexpected connection, would be the catalyst for events that would reshape both their lives in ways they could never have anticipated. In the coming days, the tension in the mansion grew palpable. Dylan, preoccupied with whatever business crisis Arnaldo's call had hinted at, became even more withdrawn. He left earlier for the office and returned late, often heading straight to his study without a word to anyone. Morgan, for her part, found herself increasingly curious about the man she'd married. The glimpses she'd seen of his past, of the cracks in his carefully maintained facade, only fueled her desire to understand him better. It wasn't out of any romantic notion, rather, it was a survival instinct, honed by years on the streets. Understanding Dylan meant understanding her place in this strange new world she'd entered. One evening, about 2 weeks into their arrangement, Morgan was in the kitchen, attempting to make herself a late-night snack. She'd skipped dinner, uncomfortable with the formal setting and the staff's watchful eyes. As she rummaged through the refrigerator, she heard the front door open and close, followed by unsteady footsteps. Curious, she peeked out into the hallway. Dylan was there, his usual polished appearance in disarray. His tie was loosened, his hair mussed, and in his hand was a half-empty bottle of scotch. He stumbled slightly, catching himself on the wall. Morgan hesitated, unsure whether to retreat or offer help. The decision was made for her when Dylan looked up, his bleary eyes focusing on her. "Well, if it isn't my lovely wife," he said, his words slurring slightly. "Come to check on your investment?" Morgan stepped fully into the hallway, her guard up but concern evident in her voice. "Dylan, are you all right? Do you need help getting upstairs?" He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed in the empty foyer. "Help? From you? That's rich. Tell me, Morgan, what exactly do you think you can help me with? Do you know how to stop a company from crumbling? How to tell if your oldest friend is betraying you?" The raw pain in his voice caught Morgan off guard. This wasn't the cold, calculating man she'd come to know. This was someone wounded, vulnerable. "I may not know about companies," she said carefully, taking a step toward him, "but I do know about betrayal and loneliness and feeling like the whole world is against you." Dylan stared at her, his eyes narrowing as if seeing her for the first time. "Do you now? And what would someone like you know about my world?" Morgan's jaw tightened, a flash of her own pain crossing her features. "I may not know your world, Dylan, but pain is universal. Rich or poor, we all bleed the same." For a long moment they stood there, the air heavy with unspoken words and shared understanding. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the vulnerability in Dylan's eyes shuttered. He straightened, his mask of indifference slipping back into place despite his inebriated state. "I don't need your amateur psychology," he snapped. Just stay out of my way." He brushed past her, heading for the stairs. Morgan watched him go, a mix of emotions swirling inside her. As Dylan reached the top of the stairs, he paused, turning back to look at her. "Morgan," he said, his voice softer now, almost uncertain. "The book. Did you like it?" The question caught her off guard. "Yes," she replied honestly. "Very much." Dylan nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Good. That's good." With that, he disappeared down the hallway, leaving Morgan standing alone in the foyer, more confused than ever about the enigma that was Dylan Morissette. The next morning, tension hung in the air like a storm about to break. Dylan emerged from his room, impeccably dressed as always, but with dark circles under his eyes betraying his rough night. He found Morgan in the morning room, nursing a cup of coffee and reading the financial section of the newspaper. He paused in the doorway, taking in the scene. It struck him how naturally she seemed to fit into this setting now, a far cry from the awkward, out-of-place woman who had first entered his home. Morgan looked up, meeting his gaze. "Good morning," she said, her tone neutral. "There's fresh coffee if you'd like some." Dylan nodded, moving to pour himself a cup. As he did, his eyes fell on the newspaper in front of her. "Since when do you read the financial news?" he asked, unable to keep the surprise from his voice. Morgan shrugged, a hint of defiance in her eyes. "Know your enemy, right? Isn't that what they say in the business world?" Dylan's eyebrow arched. "Is that what I am to you? An enemy?" "I don't know what you are to me, Dylan," Morgan replied, her voice soft but firm. "But I do know that knowledge is power, and in this house, in this life, I need all the power I can get." Dylan studied her for a long moment, a mixture of surprise and grudging respect in his eyes. "Fair enough," he finally said, taking a seat across from her. "So, what have you learned about the enemy?" Morgan hesitated, unsure if this was a test or a genuine question. Deciding to take a risk, she leaned forward, tapping a section of the newspaper. "Your company's stock dropped 3% yesterday. There are rumors of irregularities in the financial reports. And," she added, meeting his gaze directly, "the name Arnaldo Russo is mentioned more than once." Dylan's face hardened, his grip on his coffee cup tightening. "You seem to have done your homework," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "But I'd advise you to stay out of matters that don't concern you." "Don't they concern me?" Morgan countered, surprising herself with her boldness. "I may not have chosen this marriage, Dylan, but for better or worse, I'm part of your life now. What affects you affects me." For a moment, Dylan looked like he might lash out, but then something shifted in his expression. He leaned back, a wry smile touching his lips. "You're not what I expected, Morgan Wells." "Neither are you, Dylan Morissette," she replied, a hint of a smile on her own face. The moment was interrupted by the shrill ring of Dylan's phone. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. "I have to take this," he said, standing abruptly. As he moved to leave the room, he paused, looking back at Morgan. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for the coffee." With that, he was gone, leaving Morgan to ponder the complexities of the man she'd married. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Dylan was in and out of the house, his phone constantly buzzing with calls and messages. Morgan tried to stay out of the way, but she couldn't help noticing the increasing tension in Dylan's demeanor. As evening fell, the mansion came alive with activity. Staff hurried about, preparing for what appeared to be a dinner party. Morgan, feeling out of place in the chaos, retreated to the library. She was deep in a book when the door opened, revealing Dylan. He looked tired, the weight of his concerns evident in the set of his shoulders. "There you are," he said, his voice lacking its usual edge. "I've been looking for you." Morgan set her book aside. Curiosity piqued. "Is everything all right?" Dylan ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she'd never seen from him before. "No, not really. Look, I need a favor." Morgan's eyebrows rose. This was unexpected. "A favor? I'm hosting a dinner tonight. Important clients. I need you there as my wife." The request hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. This wasn't part of their arrangement, not really. But as Morgan looked at Dylan, she saw something she'd never seen before. Vulnerability. "Okay," she said softly. "I'll be there." Relief flooded Dylan's features, quickly masked by his usual composure. "Thank you. There's a dress in your room. We'll be starting at 8. As he turned to leave, Morgan called out, "Dylan?" He paused, looking back at her. "Whatever's going on, I hope it works out." For a moment, Dylan's mask slipped, revealing a glimpse of the man beneath, tired, worried, and perhaps a little grateful. Then it was gone, replaced by his usual stoic expression. With a nod, he left, leaving Morgan to prepare for what promised to be an interesting evening. As she dressed for dinner, Morgan couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into a pivotal moment. The dress Dylan had provided was elegant but understated, a deep blue that complemented her eyes. As she looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. At precisely 8 o'clock, Morgan descended the stairs to find Dylan waiting in the foyer. His eyes widened slightly as he saw her, a flicker of appreciation crossing his face before he schooled his features back to neutrality. "You look appropriate," he said, offering his arm. "Remember, these people are important. Just be yourself." Morgan raised an eyebrow at the contradictory instructions, but took his arm without comment. As they entered the dining room, she was struck by the opulence of the setting. Crystal glasses sparkled under the chandelier's light, and the air was heavy with the scent of expensive perfumes and even more expensive food. The guests were already seated, their conversations hushing as Dylan and Morgan entered. Morgan felt the weight of their stares, the unspoken judgments. but she held her head high. She'd faced worse on the streets. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dylan announced, his voice commanding immediate attention, "allow me to introduce my wife, Morgan." The introductions that followed were a blur of names and titles. Morgan did her best to keep up, offering smiles and handshakes where appropriate. As they took their seats, she found herself next to a distinguished-looking man in his 60s. "Mrs. Morissette," he said, his voice warm but his eyes calculating. "I'm Richard Vega. I must say, we've all been quite curious about you." Morgan met his gaze steadily. "I'm sure you have, Mr. Vega. I hope I don't disappoint." Richard chuckled, raising his glass in a small salute. "Oh, I doubt you could, my dear. Tell me, how are you finding married life?" Before Morgan could respond, Dylan cut in from across the table. "I'm sure Morgan would rather not bore you with domestic details, Richard. Shall we discuss the merger?" The conversation quickly turned to business, a world of jargon and power plays that Morgan could only partly follow, but she listened intently, picking up on undercurrents of tension, particularly when Arnaldo Russo's name was mentioned. As the main course was served, Morgan noticed Dylan becoming increasingly agitated. His responses were sharper, his smiles more forced. When Richard Vega made a pointed comment about financial irregularities, Dylan's knuckles went white around his fork. Acting on instinct, Morgan placed her hand on Dylan's arm. He stiffened at first, then slowly relaxed. When he spoke again, his voice was calmer, more controlled. The rest of the dinner passed in a delicate dance of diplomacy and veiled threats. Morgan found herself drawn into conversations, offering insights that seemed to surprise both the guests and Dylan. Her experiences on the streets, it turned out, had given her a unique perspective on human nature, a perspective these titans of industry found oddly refreshing. As the evening wound down, Morgan overheard a snippet of conversation between Dylan and Richard Vega. "You've got quite a woman there, Dylan," Vega was saying, his voice low. "Not at all what I expected. Perhaps there's hope for this merger after all." Dylan's response was too quiet for Morgan to hear, but the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease slightly. Later, as the last of the guests were saying their goodbyes, Morgan found herself alone with Dylan in the foyer. For a moment they stood in silence, the events of the evening hanging between them. "Thank you," Dylan finally said, his voice gruff but sincere. You did well tonight." Morgan nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "You're welcome. I hope it helped." Dylan ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Morgan was beginning to recognize as a sign of his inner turmoil. "It did. More than you know." He turned to her then, his eyes searching her face as if seeing her for the first time. "Morgan, But whatever he was about to say was cut off by the sharp ring of his phone. Glancing at the screen, his face hardened. "I have to take this," he said, already moving towards his study. "Good night, Morgan. And thank you again." As she watched him go, Morgan couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. The walls were still there, but they were crumbling, brick by brick. In his study, Dylan answered the call, his voice low and urgent. "Arnaldo, what's going on? The Vega dinner was a disaster. They're asking questions we can't answer." Arnaldo's voice came through, panic evident in every word. "Dylan, we've got a bigger problem. The SEC is launching an investigation. They know about the offshore accounts. We're in trouble, man, real trouble." As the implications of Arnaldo's words sank in, Dylan felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Everything he'd built, everything he'd sacrificed for, it was all in jeopardy. And in that moment of crisis, his thoughts turned not to his empire, not to his wealth, but to the woman who had just saved him from disaster at dinner. Morgan. What would this mean for her? For the first time in years, Dylan Morissette felt truly afraid, not just for himself, but for someone else, and that realization shook him to his core. The days following the dinner party were marked by a palpable tension in the Morissette mansion. Dylan was a whirlwind of activity, constantly on the phone or locked away in his study. The staff moved about with heightened caution, sensing the storm brewing beneath their employer's tightly controlled exterior. Morgan, for her part, found herself in an unexpected position. The dinner party had shifted something in her relationship with Dylan, creating a tentative bridge across the chasm that had separated them. She caught him watching her with a mix of curiosity and something else, something that looked almost like respect. One evening, about a week after the party, Morgan was in the library, curled up in her favorite armchair, with a well-worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. The room had become her sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself in stories and forget for a moment the complexities of her new life. The door opened, and Dylan entered, his tie loosened, and his hair slightly disheveled. He looked surprised to see her, as if he'd forgotten she might be there. "Oh, I'm sorry," he said, his voice lacking its usual sharp edge. "I didn't mean to disturb you." Morgan set her book aside, studying him. The strain of the past week was evident in the dark circles under his eyes and the tension in his shoulders. "You're not disturbing me," she said softly. "Are you okay, Dylan?" He let out a harsh laugh, moving to the drink cart in the corner. "Okay. No, I don't think I am." He poured himself a generous measure of scotch, then, after a moment's hesitation, poured a second glass. He brought it to Morgan, offering it without a word. She took it, their fingers brushing momentarily. The contact seemed to jolt Dylan, and he quickly stepped back, sinking into the chair opposite her. For a long moment they sat in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Finally Dylan spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm losing everything, Morgan. The company, my reputation, everything I've worked for." Morgan leaned forward, her eyes searching his face. "The SEC investigation?" Dylan's head snapped up, surprise and suspicion flashing in his eyes. "How do you know about that?" She shrugged, a small sad smile playing at her lips. "The walls have ears, Dylan, and I've learned to listen." He studied her for a moment, then nodded, some of the tension leaving his body. "Yes, the SEC investigation, and it's worse than I thought. Arnaldo, he's been embezzling funds for years, millions of dollars, hidden in offshore accounts, and now it's all unraveling." Morgan took a sip of her scotch, letting the burn ground her. "Can't you distance yourself from it? Claim ignorance?" Dylan shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "I should have known. I should have seen the signs. The board, the investors. They'll crucify me for this." As Morgan watched him, she saw not the cold, calculating businessman she'd first met, but a man on the verge of breaking. Without thinking, she reached out, placing her hand on his arm. "Tell me," she said softly, and to her surprise, and his, he did. Dylan spoke of his father, a self-made man who had built Morissette Enterprises from the ground up, of the pressure to live up to his legacy, to be not just successful, but extraordinary. He spoke of long nights and longer days, of sacrificing friendships and relationships for the sake of the company. "I thought I was invincible," he said, his voice hollow. "I thought if I just worked hard enough, was smart enough, I could control everything. But now..." Morgan listened, her heart aching for the lonely boy beneath the hardened exterior. When Dylan finally fell silent, she spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "You're not alone in this, Dylan. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." He looked at her then, really looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. "Why?" he asked, his voice raw with emotion. "Why would you help me? After everything..." Morgan took a deep breath, steeling herself. It was time, she realized, to share her own story. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything," she began, "to feel like the whole world is against you." And so, as the night deepened around them, Morgan told Dylan her story. She spoke of a childhood marked by poverty and neglect, of a mother who tried her best but couldn't overcome her own demons, of a father who left when the burden of family became too much to bear. She told him of her teenage years, of dropping out of school to care for her dying mother, of the crushing loneliness that followed her mother's death, and the desperate choices that led her to the streets. "I was 15, Morgan said, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "No family, no home, no future. I did what I had to do to survive." She spoke of the dangers of life on the streets, the violence, the hunger, the constant fear. But she also spoke of unexpected kindnesses, of the makeshift family she found among other lost souls. "There was this woman, Rosa," Morgan said, a small smile touching her lips. "She ran a shelter, but it was more than that. She taught us, helped us get our GEDs, showed us that we had value beyond our circumstances." As she spoke, Dylan found himself hanging on every word. The woman before him was a far cry from the simple pawn he'd imagined when he made that fateful bet. She was a survivor, resilient and strong in ways he was only beginning to understand. "What happened to Rosa?" he asked softly when Morgan fell silent. A shadow passed over her face. "The shelter lost its funding. Rosa tried to keep it going on her own, but It wasn't enough. Last I heard, she was working 3 jobs just to keep a roof over her head. Dylan nodded, his mind already working. An idea was forming, nebulous but compelling. "Morgan," he said, leaning forward, what if we could do something like that? On a larger scale." She looked at him, confusion evident in her eyes. "What do you mean?" "A project," Dylan said, his excitement growing. "A way to help people like Rosa, like the people you knew on the streets. We have the resources, the connections." Morgan's eyes widened as she grasped what he was suggesting. "You want to start a charity?" Dylan shook his head, a fire in his eyes that she'd never seen before. "Not a charity, a revolution. A renaissance, we could call it Project Renaissance." As they began to discuss the possibilities, the tension that had defined their relationship began to melt away. For the first time, they were partners, working together towards a common goal. Hours passed, filled with animated discussion and planning. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, they finally fell silent, exhausted but exhilarated. Dylan looked at Morgan, a newfound warmth in his gaze. "Thank you," he said softly, "for listening, for sharing your story, for everything." Morgan smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that lit up her entire face. "Thank you for hearing me," she replied. As they parted ways to get some much-needed rest, both felt the shift that had occurred. The walls between them hadn't completely fallen, but they had cracked, allowing the first tendrils of genuine connection to take root. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. While Dylan continued to grapple with the SEC investigation and the fallout from Arnaldo's betrayal, he and Morgan threw themselves into planning Project Renaissance. Morgan's street smarts and first-hand experience proved invaluable as they mapped out the project's goals and structure. She knew the challenges faced by those living on the margins of society, the gaps in existing support systems, and the kind of help that could make a real difference. Dylan, for his part, brought his business acumen and connections to the table. He reached out to contacts in real estate, education, and social services, laying the groundwork for what they hoped would be a comprehensive support network for those in need. As they worked side by side, often late into the night, the dynamic between them continued to evolve. The cold formality that had marked their early interactions gave way to a comfortable camaraderie. They found themselves sharing jokes, exchanging ideas, and even, on occasion, casual touches that sent unexpected sparks through both of them. One afternoon, as they pored over potential locations for the project's first center, Dylan's phone rang. The caller ID showed Arnaldo's name, and Dylan's face immediately hardened. "I should take this," he said, moving to leave the room. Morgan caught his arm, her touch gentle but firm. "Let me listen in," she said. "I might hear something you miss." Dylan hesitated, then nodded, putting the phone on speaker. Arnaldo's voice came through, tense and strained. "Dylan, we need to talk. The SEC is closing in. They're going to want to question you directly." Dylan's jaw clenched. "What exactly are they going to find, Arnaldo? How deep does this go?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Deeper than you know," Arnaldo finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dylan, I'm sorry. I never meant for it to go this far." As Arnaldo began to detail the extent of his embezzlement, Morgan watched Dylan carefully. She saw the shock, the anger, the betrayal play across his face, but beneath it all, she saw something else: fear. When the call ended, Dylan slumped in his chair, looking more defeated than Morgan had ever seen him. "It's over," he said, his voice hollow. "Everything I've built, it's all going to come crashing down." Morgan knelt beside him, taking his hands in hers. "No," she said firmly. "It's not over. We can fix this." Dylan looked at her, disbelief evident in his eyes. "How?" The SEC will want to know the truth," Morgan interrupted. "So we give it to them. All of it." She outlined a plan, one that involved full disclosure, cooperation with the investigation, and a proactive approach to making amends. It was risky, but it offered a chance at salvaging not just the company, but Dylan's reputation. As she spoke, Dylan felt a warmth spreading through his chest. This woman, who he had once seen as nothing more than a pawn in a cruel game, was now fighting for him, believing in him when he could barely believe in himself. "Why are you doing this?" he asked when she finished, echoing the question he'd asked that night in the library. Morgan's answer was simple but profound. "Because I see the good in you, Dylan, The man you could be if you'd let yourself. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to fall away. Dylan leaned forward, drawn by a force he couldn't name. Morgan's breath caught in her throat, her heart racing. But before their lips could meet, a crash from outside shattered the moment. They rushed to the window to see a car had veered off the road, smashing into the gates of the estate. Without hesitation, they ran outside. The driver, an elderly man, was slumped over the wheel, clearly in distress. "Call an ambulance," Dylan shouted to the security guard who had come running. Together, he and Morgan managed to get the car door open. As Dylan carefully supported the man's head, Morgan checked for a pulse. "It's weak," she said, her voice tense. "I think he's having a heart attack." What happened next was a blur of activity. Morgan, drawing on skills she'd learned on the streets, began CPR. Dylan, following her instructions, assisted as best he could. By the time the ambulance arrived, the man was breathing on his own, though still unconscious. As the paramedics loaded him into the ambulance, one of them turned to Morgan and Dylan. "You saved his life," he said. "If you hadn't acted so quickly." As the ambulance drove away, sirens blaring, Dylan and Morgan stood in silence, the adrenaline of the moment slowly fading. Finally, Dylan turned to Morgan, his eyes filled with a new kind of respect and admiration. "You were amazing," he said softly. Morgan shrugged, but couldn't hide the flush of pride on her cheeks. "We both were." As they walked back to the house, Dylan's hand found Morgan's, their fingers intertwining naturally. Neither commented on it, but both felt the significance of the gesture. That night, as they sat in the library, the events of the day still fresh in their minds, Dylan broke the comfortable silence. "Morgan," he said, his voice serious, "I need to tell you something." She looked at him, curiosity and a hint of apprehension in her eyes. "What is it?" Dylan took a deep breath, steeling himself. "Our marriage, it wasn't just a whim. It was a bet. A cruel, stupid bet with my so-called friends." He expected anger, disappointment, perhaps even hatred. What he didn't expect was the soft, sad smile that crossed Morgan's face. "I know," she said simply. Dylan's eyes widened in shock. "You know?" Morgan nodded. "I've known for a while. I overheard you talking to one of your friends on the phone a few weeks ago." "Why didn't you say anything?" Dylan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Morgan's eyes met his, filled with a mixture of emotions he couldn't quite decipher. Because somewhere along the way, it stopped being about the bet. For both of us, I think. The weight of her words hung between them, heavy with implication. Dylan felt something shift inside him, a wall crumbling, a truth he'd been denying finally breaking free. "Morgan, he began, but was cut off by the shrill ring of his phone. The caller ID showed an unknown number. With a sense of foreboding, Dylan answered, putting it on speaker. "Mr. Morissette," a stern voice came through. "This is Agent Simmons with the SEC. We need you to come in for questioning immediately." As the implications of those words sank in, Dylan and Morgan's eyes met. In that moment, they both knew everything was about to change. The journey they had begun as strangers, thrust together by a cruel bet, had led them to this point, and whatever came next, they would face it together. The call ended, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Dylan's hand shook slightly as he set the phone down, the reality of the situation crashing over him like a tidal wave. Morgan moved closer, placing her hand over his. "We knew this was coming," she said softly. "We have a plan, remember?" Dylan nodded, drawing strength from her touch and her words. "You're right. We do." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, something he wasn't quite ready to name. "Morgan, I don't know what I would do without you." She smiled, a warm, reassuring gesture that seemed to light up the room. "Lucky for you, you don't have to find out. We're in this together, remember?" As they began to prepare for the impending meeting with the SEC, gathering documents and rehearsing their strategy, Dylan found himself marveling at the turn his life had taken. The woman he had married on a whim, as part of a cruel bet, had become his strongest ally, his partner in every sense of the word. The night wore on, filled with preparation and quiet moments of support. As dawn broke, casting a soft glow through the library windows, Dylan and Morgan stood side by side, ready to face whatever the day would bring. "Whatever happens," Dylan said, his voice low and intense, "I want you to know that I—" But before he could finish, a loud crash echoed through the mansion, followed by the sound of breaking glass and heavy footsteps. Dylan and Morgan exchanged alarmed glances. "What was that?" Morgan whispered. Before Dylan could respond, the library door burst open. 3 men in masks rushed in, brandishing weapons. "Don't move!" one of them shouted. "Hands where we can see them!" In that moment of crisis, as fear and adrenaline coursed through their veins, Dylan did something that surprised even himself. He stepped in front of Morgan, shielding her with his body. "Take whatever you want," he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Just don't hurt her." As the intruders advanced, Dylan and Morgan found themselves backed against the wall, their hands intertwined, facing the unknown together. In that moment of peril, one thing became crystal clear. Their bond, forged in the crucible of shared struggles and unexpected connection, was stronger than either of them had realized. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not just their newfound partnership, but the very foundations of the life they had begun to build together. The tension in the library was palpable as Dylan and Morgan stood facing the masked intruders. Dylan's mind raced, assessing their options, while Morgan's street-honed instincts kicked into high gear. "Look," Dylan said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Whatever you're after, we can talk about this. There's no need for violence." The lead intruder, a tall man with piercing blue eyes visible through his mask, laughed harshly. "Talk? Oh, we're well past talking, Mr. Morissette. Your time for talking was weeks ago, when you first got wind of the SEC investigation." Dylan's blood ran cold as realization dawned. These weren't random burglars. This was connected to Arnaldo and the embezzlement scandal. Before he could respond, Morgan stepped forward, her voice calm but authoritative. "You're making a mistake. Whatever Arnaldo told you, it's not the full story." The intruders hesitated, clearly not expecting this level of awareness from their targets. In that moment of uncertainty, Morgan acted. With a swift movement that spoke of hard-earned experience, she knocked a heavy bookend off the nearby shelf, sending it crashing into the lead intruder's hand. His weapon clattered to the floor. Chaos erupted. Dylan, spurred by Morgan's actions, tackled one of the other men. Years of pent-up aggression and newfound protective instinct fueled his attack. Morgan, meanwhile, had snatched up the fallen weapon and was holding the third intruder at bay. The sounds of their struggle must have alerted the security team, because suddenly the room was flooded with guards. The intruders, outmatched, were quickly subdued. As the police were called and statements were taken, Dylan couldn't take his eyes off Morgan. She stood tall, unfazed by the violence, giving clear and concise information to the authorities. This woman, he realized, was unlike anyone he'd ever known. Hours later, as the last police car pulled away from the mansion, Dylan and Morgan found themselves alone in the study. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving them both exhausted but oddly energized. "Are you okay?" Dylan asked, genuine concern in his voice. Morgan nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "I'm fine, you?" "Thanks to you," he replied, his voice soft with admiration. "Morgan, that was incredible. Where did you learn to handle yourself like that?" A shadow passed over her face. "Life on the streets teaches you a lot of things, Dylan, not all of them pleasant." He moved closer, hesitantly placing a hand on her arm. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to bring up bad memories." Morgan covered his hand with hers, the touch sending a jolt through both of them. "It's okay, those experiences, they made me who I am. And right now, who I am is someone who can help you navigate this mess with Arnaldo." At the mention of Arnaldo's name, Dylan's face hardened. "You're right. We need to deal with this head-on." He paused, looking at her intently. "Morgan, I know I have no right to ask this of you, but will you help me?" Her answer was immediate and unwavering. "Of course. We're in this together, remember?" The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Dylan and Morgan threw themselves into untangling the web of deceit Arnaldo had woven. They pored over financial records, interviewed employees, and pieced together a timeline of the embezzlement. Morgan's street smarts proved invaluable. She had an uncanny ability to spot inconsistencies and follow money trails that even Dylan's experienced eye had missed. Together, they built a case that not only exposed the full extent of Arnaldo's crimes, but also clearly demonstrated Dylan's ignorance of the scheme. As they worked side by side, often late into the night, Dylan found himself opening up to Morgan in ways he never had with anyone before. He shared stories of his childhood, of the pressure to live up to his father's legacy, of the loneliness that came with success. One night, as they took a break from their investigation, Dylan confessed, You know, I've always envied people who had nothing to lose. I thought they must be free in a way I never could be. Morgan looked at him, her eyes filled with understanding and a hint of sadness. Having nothing to lose isn't freedom, Dylan. It's a different kind of prison. Her words struck a chord in him, making him see his privilege and his struggles in a new light. I'm beginning to understand that, he said softly. Thank you, Morgan, for everything. As the case against Arnaldo solidified, Dylan and Morgan also turned their attention to Project Renaissance. What had started as a vague idea born of a late-night conversation was rapidly taking shape as a comprehensive program to help people transition out of homelessness. Morgan threw herself into the project with passion and purpose. She reached out to old contacts from her days on the street, gathering insights and identifying needs that traditional charities often overlooked. Her eyes lit up as she outlined plans for job training programs, mental health support, and transitional housing. Dylan watched her in these moments, marveling at her transformation. The guarded, wary woman he'd first met was blossoming into a confident, driven force of nature. He found himself looking forward to their planning sessions, not just for the progress they made on the project, but for the chance to see Morgan in her element. As they presented their plans to potential partners and investors, Dylan couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. Morgan handled herself with grace and authority, her first-hand experience lending weight to her words. More than once he caught himself staring at her, wondering how he'd ever seen her as anything less than extraordinary. Their efforts were beginning to pay off. The SEC, presented with the evidence Dylan and Morgan had compiled, was inclined to view Dylan as a victim of Arnaldo's scheme rather than a co-conspirator. Arnaldo, faced with the mountain of evidence against him, had agreed to a plea deal that would spare Morissette Enterprises the worst of the fallout. Project Renaissance was gaining traction too. They had secured a building for their first center and were in talks with several major corporations about funding and job placement programs. But as things were looking up on the business front, a shadow from Morgan's past loomed on the horizon. It started with a series of hang-up calls to the mansion. Then came the unmarked envelopes containing photos of Morgan from her time on the streets. Dylan noticed Morgan growing tense, jumping at unexpected noises, constantly looking over her shoulder. Finally, unable to bear seeing her in distress, Dylan confronted her. "Morgan, what's going on? Who's behind these threats?" Morgan hesitated, fear and shame warring in her eyes. Finally, she took a deep breath and began to speak. "His name is Marcos. He was my pimp, back when I was on the streets." Dylan felt a surge of anger, both at this unknown man and at the circumstances that had forced Morgan into such a life. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice gentle but firm. And so Morgan did. She spoke of Marcos's cruelty, of the way he preyed on vulnerable young women, of the violence he used to keep them in line. She told Dylan about her escape, how she'd lived in constant fear of being found. "And now he's found you," Dylan said, his fists clenched at his sides. Morgan nodded, tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Dylan. I never meant to bring this danger into your life. If you want me to leave, I'll understand." Dylan's response was immediate and fierce. He crossed the room in 2 strides, taking Morgan's hands in his. "Don't you dare apologize," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're not going anywhere. We'll face this together, just like everything else." The intensity in his eyes took Morgan's breath away. For the first time in years, she felt truly safe. Over the next few days, Dylan sprang into action. He hired additional security, had the mansion's systems upgraded, and reached out to contacts in law enforcement. Morgan watched him work, a mix of gratitude and something deeper, something she wasn't quite ready to name, filling her heart. Despite their precautions, Marcos made his move. It happened one evening as Morgan was leaving a meeting about Project Renaissance. She had just reached her car when a hand clamped over her mouth and a familiar voice hissed in her ear, "Hello, beautiful. Miss me?" Fear paralyzed her for a moment, old traumas rushing back. But then, something shifted. She thought of Dylan, of the strength she'd found in their partnership. With a surge of adrenaline, she fought back, her elbow connecting solidly with Marcus's ribs. The struggle was brief but violent. Morgan held her own, years of pent-up anger and newfound confidence fueling her resistance. But Marcos was stronger, and he was armed. Just as things were looking dire, a car screeched into the parking lot. Dylan leapt out, his face a mask of fury. "Get away from her!" he roared, charging towards them. Marcos, caught off guard by the interruption, hesitated. It was all the opening Morgan needed. She broke free, stumbling towards Dylan. What followed was a tense standoff. Marcos, realizing he was outmatched, tried to flee, but Dylan, driven by a protective instinct he'd never known he possessed, tackled him to the ground. As sirens wailed in the distance, Dylan had triggered a silent alarm on his phone. Marcos was subdued. Morgan watched, her heart pounding, as the man who had haunted her nightmares for years was led away in handcuffs. In the aftermath, as they gave their statements to the police, Dylan couldn't stop touching Morgan, a hand on her back, fingers intertwined, as if reassuring himself that she was really there, really safe. Finally, as the last police car pulled away, they were alone. Morgan turned to Dylan, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You saved me," she said softly. Dylan shook his head, pulling her close. "No, Morgan. You saved yourself. You've been saving yourself all along. I just had the privilege of watching you do it." They stood there in the parking lot, holding each other, neither willing to let go. The events of the night had shaken them both, but had also crystallized something that had been building between them for weeks. Dylan pulled back slightly, his hands coming up to frame Morgan's face. "Morgan, I need to tell you something." She looked up at him, her heart racing. "What is it?" He took a deep breath, years of emotional walls crumbling in an instant. "I love you," he said simply. "I think I have for a while now. And I know this started as a bet, as a game, but it's not anymore. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me." Morgan's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she was that scared girl on the streets again, afraid to trust, to hope. But as she looked into Dylan's eyes, she saw nothing but sincerity and love. "I love you too," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "God help me, but I do." Their lips met in a kiss that was both gentle and passionate, a culmination of months of growing trust and deepening connection. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless and smiling. "So," Dylan said, his forehead resting against hers, "what do we do now?" Morgan laughed, a sound of pure joy that made Dylan's heart soar. Now we go home. We have a company to save, a project to launch and a life to build, together." As they drove back to the mansion, their home, Dylan couldn't help but marvel at the twist his life had taken. The bet that was supposed to prove his invulnerability to emotion had instead opened his heart in ways he never thought possible. Morgan, watching the city lights blur past the car window, felt a sense of peace she'd never known before. The girl who had fought and scraped to survive on the streets had found not just safety and purpose, but love. They pulled up to the mansion, its lights warm and welcoming in the night. As they walked hand in hand towards the door, both knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The unlikely pair, the cold businessman and the street-smart survivor, had found in each other not just partners, but soulmates. The future stretched out before them, full of promise and possibility. Project Renaissance was poised to change lives. Morissette Enterprises, under their joint guidance, was set to become a force for good in the world. And at the heart of it all was a love story that defied all odds. As they crossed the threshold, Dylan paused, turning to Morgan with a mischievous glint in his eye. "You know," he said, "I think it's time we renewed our vows. For real this time." Morgan's laugh echoed through the foyer, a sound of pure happiness. "Mr. Morissette," she said, her eyes sparkling, "I thought you'd never ask." And with that, they closed the door on the past and stepped into their future, together. The weeks following Marcos's arrest were a whirlwind of activity for Dylan and Morgan. With the immediate threat neutralized, they threw themselves into finalizing plans for Project Renaissance and navigating the fallout from Arnaldo's embezzlement scheme. Yet beneath the surface of their busy days, a current of unease lingered. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves swirled in the breeze outside the mansion's windows, Dylan found Morgan in the library, her brow furrowed as she pored over a stack of legal documents. "Hey," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. "How's it going?" Morgan looked up, a tired smile touching her lips. Slowly, "These liability waivers for the Renaissance Center are a nightmare." She stretched, wincing slightly. "But we're making progress." Dylan moved behind her, his hands gently kneading her tense shoulders. "You're amazing, you know that? The way you've thrown yourself into this project, I've never seen anything like it." Morgan leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. "It matters to me," she said simply. "These people we're trying to help I was them not so long ago. If I can make even a small difference." Her voice trailed off as Dylan's hands stilled. She felt him lean down, his breath warm against her ear. "You're making more than a small difference, Morgan. You're changing lives, including mine." She turned to face him, her heart swelling with emotion. The man before her was so different from the cold, calculating businessman she'd first met. The walls he'd built around himself had crumbled, revealing a compassionate, driven individual who matched her passion for making the world better. As their lips met in a tender kiss, Morgan allowed herself to believe just for a moment that everything might work out, that the shadows of her past were finally behind her. But fate had other plans. Later that afternoon, as Morgan was leaving a meeting with potential donors for Project Renaissance, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Her blood ran cold as she read the message. "Did you really think a few cops could stop me, beautiful? We have unfinished business. See you soon." Morgan's hands shook as she called Dylan, her voice tight with fear as she relayed the message. Within minutes, he was by her side, his arm protectively around her as they hurried back to the safety of the mansion. "We need to call the police," Dylan said as soon as they were inside, his voice tense. "This is a clear violation of the restraining order." Morgan nodded, but her eyes were distant. "It won't stop him, Dylan. You don't know Marcos like I do. He's relentless. And he has connections. Corrupt cops, judges. That's how he stayed in business so long." Dylan's jaw clenched, his protective instincts flaring. "Then we'll hire private security. I'll call in every favor, use every resource I have. He won't touch you, Morgan, I promise." As Morgan looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears, Dylan felt a fierce surge of love and determination. He cupped her face gently, his voice soft but intense. "I meant what I said before. I love you, Morgan, and I will do whatever it takes to keep you safe." Morgan leaned into his touch, drawing strength from his presence. "I love you too," she whispered. "God, Dylan, I never thought I could feel this way about anyone. After everything I've been through." Her voice trailed off, and Dylan sensed there was more to her story than she'd shared. "Tell me," he urged gently. "Whatever it is, Morgan, you can tell me." Taking a deep breath, Morgan began to speak. She told Dylan of her life under Marcos's control, the daily abuse, the degradation, the constant fear. She spoke of the other girls, some even younger than she had been, and the helplessness she felt watching them suffer. "There was this one girl," Morgan said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lily, she was only 16. Marcos, he was particularly cruel to her. One night, it went too far. I tried to stop him, but—" She broke off, a sob catching in her throat. Dylan held her close, his heart breaking for the pain she'd endured. "It wasn't your fault," he murmured. "You were a victim too." Morgan shook her head, pulling back to meet his gaze. "That's just it, Dylan. I wasn't just a victim. After Lily, I knew I had to get out. Not just for me, but for all the other girls. I started gathering evidence, dates, names, financial records. I was going to go to the police, bring the whole operation down." Understanding dawned in Dylan's eyes. "That's why Marcos is so determined to find you. You're a threat to his entire empire." Morgan nodded, fear and determination warring in her expression. "I hid the evidence before I ran. It's still out there, somewhere safe. If we could get to it." Dylan's mind raced with possibilities. "We could take him down for good," he finished. "Morgan, this is huge, but it's also incredibly dangerous. Are you sure you want to do this?" For a moment, Morgan was silent, the weight of the decision heavy on her shoulders. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I have to," she said. "For Lily, for all the girls who didn't make it out, and for me." The next few days were a flurry of activity. Dylan called in every favor he had, assembling a team of trusted private security experts and discreet investigators. Morgan worked with them, piecing together the trail she'd left years ago, leading to the hidden evidence. As they worked, the threat from Marcos escalated. More messages arrived, each more menacing than the last. Twice, suspicious figures were spotted lurking near the mansion grounds. The pressure was mounting, and both Dylan and Morgan felt the strain. One evening, as they sat in the library reviewing security plans, Morgan suddenly stood, pacing restlessly. Maybe I should just go," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "Turn myself over to Marcos, at least then you'd be safe." Dylan was on his feet in an instant, his hands gripping her shoulders. "Don't you dare," he said fiercely. "We're in this together, remember? I'm not letting you face this alone. Morgan looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. Why? She asked softly. Why are you willing to risk everything for me? Dylan's expression softened, his love for her shining in his eyes. Because you're worth it, he said simply. Because loving you has made me a better man, and because I believe in what we're doing, not just with Marcos, but with Project Renaissance, with the company. Together, Morgan, we can make a real difference in the world. His words washed over her like a balm, soothing her fears and strengthening her resolve. Standing on tiptoe, Morgan kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. When they parted, both were breathless. Okay, Morgan said, a new determination in her voice. Let's end this once and for all. The plan they devised was risky, but it was their best shot at bringing Marcos down for good. Using herself as bait, Morgan would lure Marcos to a predetermined location. Dylan and their security team would be waiting, ready to apprehend him and secure the evidence. As the day of the operation dawned, tension hung heavy in the air. Dylan and Morgan moved through their preparations in near silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Just before Morgan was set to leave, Dylan pulled her into a fierce embrace. Be careful, he murmured into her hair. Come back to me. Morgan hugged him back just as tightly. I will, she promised. I love you, Dylan. I love you too, he replied, his voice thick with emotion. With one last lingering look, Morgan stepped out into the crisp autumn air, ready to face her demons. The meeting place was an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, neutral ground far from Marcos's usual territory. Morgan's heart raced as she pulled up, her eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. She didn't have to wait long. A sleek black car pulled up, and Marcos emerged, flanked by two burly bodyguards. His face, once handsome, was now hard and cruel, his eyes glittering with malice as they fell on Morgan. Well, well, he drawled, sauntering towards her. Look who finally decided to come home. Did you miss me, beautiful? Morgan steeled herself, forcing her voice to remain steady. It's over, Marcos. I have the evidence. One word from me, and it all comes crashing down. Marcos's smile turned predatory. Oh, I don't think so, he said, reaching into his jacket. See, I've learned a few things since you left, like how to tie up loose ends. Time seemed to slow as Marcos pulled out a gun, leveling it at Morgan's chest. In that moment, all of her carefully laid plans flew out the window. This wasn't about evidence anymore. This was survival. Just as Marcos's finger tightened on the trigger, a voice rang out. Police! Drop your weapon! Chaos erupted. Dylan and the security team burst from their hiding places, guns drawn. Marcos's bodyguards reached for their own weapons, and the air filled with the sound of gunfire. Morgan dove for cover, her heart pounding in her ears. Through the mayhem, she caught glimpses of Dylan, his face a mask of determination as he coordinated the team's movements. The firefight was intense, but brief. Outnumbered and outgunned, Marcos and his men were quickly subdued. As the dust settled, Morgan emerged from her hiding place to find Dylan rushing towards her. Are you okay? He asked urgently, his hands roaming over her, checking for injuries. God, Morgan, when I saw him pull that gun... Morgan leaned into him, relief making her knees weak. I'm okay, she assured him. It's over, it's really over. As they watched Marcos being led away in handcuffs, his furious threats fading into the distance, Morgan felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time in years, she was truly free. The aftermath of Marcos's arrest was a whirlwind of police statements, media speculation, and legal proceedings. The evidence Morgan had gathered years ago proved damning, not just for Marcos, but for a network of corrupt officials who had enabled his operation. Through it all, Dylan remained by Morgan's side, a constant source of support and strength. His unwavering commitment to her, even in the face of public scrutiny and potential business repercussions, touched Morgan deeply. One evening, about a month after Marcos's arrest, Dylan and Morgan found themselves back in the library, where their journey had truly begun. The room was bathed in the warm glow of the fireplace, casting flickering shadows on the walls. I've been thinking, Dylan said, his voice soft but serious. About us. About everything we've been through. Morgan looked up at him, her heart skipping a beat at the intensity in his eyes. Oh, she said, trying to keep her voice light. And what conclusions have you reached, Mr. Morissette? A smile tugged at Dylan's lips as he took her hands in his. "I've concluded," he said, "that marrying you was the best decision I ever made, even if it started for all the wrong." Morgan's breath caught in her throat as Dylan sank to one knee before her. "Morgan Wells Morissette," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Will you marry me? Again? This time for all the right reasons?" Tears sprang to Morgan's eyes as she nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. Dylan slipped a ring onto her finger, not the ostentatious diamond she'd worn for their first wedding, but a simple, elegant band that suited her perfectly. As he stood gathering her into his arms, Morgan found her voice. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. 1,000 times, yes. Their kiss was tender and passionate, a promise of the future they would build together. When they finally parted, both were smiling, their eyes shining with joy and love. "You know," Morgan said, a teasing note in her voice, "most people don't get a do-over on their wedding. We're pretty lucky." Dylan laughed, the sound rich and warm. "Luck had nothing to do with it," he said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We fought for this every step of the way, and I intend to keep fighting for us for the rest of our lives." As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, the future stretched out before them, bright with promise and possibility. Project Renaissance was thriving, already changing lives across the city. Morissette Enterprises, under their joint leadership, was becoming a beacon of ethical business practices. But more than that, they had each other, two broken souls who had found healing and purpose in their unlikely union. As the firelight danced around them, Dylan and Morgan knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, stronger for the battles they'd already won, and deeply, irrevocably in love. "So," Dylan said, a mischievous glint in his eye, "shall we start planning this wedding? I'm thinking something small, intimate, just us and the people who matter most." Morgan nodded, her heart full. "That sounds perfect," she said. "And after?" Dylan's smile widened. "After, my love, we change the world, one life at a time." As they sealed this new promise with another kiss, both Dylan and Morgan felt a sense of rightness, of coming home. Their journey had been unexpected, filled with trials and triumphs, but it had led them here, to each other, to love, to a future brighter than either had dared to dream. And as the night deepened around them, the library that had witnessed the beginning of their story now stood witness to a new chapter, one written not by circumstance or cruel bets, but by choice, by love, and by the unshakable bond between two souls who had found in each other the missing pieces of themselves. The day of Dylan and Morgan's vow renewal dawned clear and bright, a stark contrast to the overcast skies that had loomed over their first wedding. As the early morning light filtered through the windows of their shared bedroom, Dylan awoke to find Morgan already up, standing by the window with a soft smile on her face. "Good morning, beautiful," he murmured, his voice still husky with sleep. "Ready for the big day?" Morgan turned to him, her eyes shining with a happiness that took his breath away. "More than ready," she replied, crossing the room to plant a gentle kiss on his lips. "I've been waiting for this day my whole life, I think. I just didn't know it until now." As they prepared for the ceremony, both couldn't help but reflect on how different this day felt compared to their first wedding. Gone was the tension, the uncertainty, the underlying current of deceit. In its place was a palpable sense of joy, of rightness, of coming home. The ceremony itself was a far cry from the lavish, impersonal affair of their first marriage. Instead of a grand cathedral filled with society's elite, they chose the sprawling gardens of the Morissette estate. Where once there had been hundreds of guests, now there were only a few dozen, true friends and loved ones who had supported them through their journey. As Morgan walked down the aisle, her simple yet elegant white dress a stark contrast to the designer gown of their first wedding, Dylan felt his heart swell with emotion. This wasn't the lost, wary woman he'd married on a bet. This was his partner, his equal, the love of his life, strong, confident, and radiantly happy. When Morgan reached him, Dylan took her hands in his, marveling at how perfectly they fit together. The officiant, a kind-faced woman who had been one of the first success stories of Project Renaissance, began the ceremony with words that brought tears to both their eyes. "We are gathered here today," she said, her voice warm and sincere, "to celebrate not just the love between Dylan and Morgan, but the journey that brought them to this moment. Theirs is a story of transformation, of two people who found in each other the courage to become their best selves." As they exchanged vows, the contrast with their first wedding couldn't have been more stark. Where once there had been cold, rehearsed lines, now there were heartfelt declarations of love and commitment. "Morgan," Dylan began, his voice thick with emotion, "when I first met you, I thought I knew everything about life, about success, about what mattered. I was wrong. You opened my eyes to a world beyond balance sheets and boardrooms. You showed me the true meaning of strength, of resilience, of love. I stand here today not as the man who made a foolish bet, but as the man you've helped me become. Someone who wants to make a difference, someone who believes in the power of second chances. I promise to love you, to support you, to be your partner in all things for as long as we both shall live." Morgan's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she spoke her own vows. "Dylan, our story didn't have the most auspicious beginning, but looking back I wouldn't change a thing, because every step of our journey has led us here. You saw me when I felt invisible. You believed in me when I'd lost faith in myself. You've been my rock, my champion, my home. I promise to stand by you, to challenge you, to love you fiercely and completely for all of our days." As they sealed their vows with a kiss, cheers and applause erupted from their guests. The love and support radiating from the small gathering was palpable, a testament to the lives Dylan and Morgan had touched in their time together. The reception that followed was a joyous affair, filled with laughter, tears, and heartfelt toasts. As the evening wore on, Dylan clinked his glass, calling for everyone's attention. "Before we continue the celebrations," he said, his arm wrapped lovingly around Morgan's waist, "my beautiful wife and I have an announcement to make." Morgan's smile widened as she placed a hand on her still flat stomach. "We're pregnant," she announced, her voice ringing with joy. "In about 7 months, there'll be a new addition to the Morissette family." The news was met with a fresh round of cheers and congratulations. As their friends and loved ones surged forward to embrace them, Dylan and Morgan exchanged a look of pure happiness. This child, conceived in love and hope, was the embodiment of their new beginning. Later, as they swayed together on the dance floor, Dylan leaned in close to Morgan's ear. "How are you feeling?" he asked softly. "Is all of this too much?" Morgan shook her head, her cheek resting against his chest. "It's perfect," she murmured. "I never thought I could be this happy, Dylan. Sometimes I'm afraid I'll wake up and find it was all a dream." Dylan tightened his arms around her. "It's real, my love. All of it. And we're just getting started." As the party continued around them, Dylan and Morgan took a moment to slip away, finding a quiet spot in the gardens where they had pledged their love anew just hours before. "Can you believe how far we've come?" Morgan mused, her fingers intertwined with Dylan's. "If someone had told me a year ago that this would be my life, I would have thought they were crazy." Dylan chuckled, bringing their joined hands to his lips for a gentle kiss. "I know what you mean. I was so lost, so closed off. I thought I had everything figured out, but I was just going through the motions." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, reflecting on their journey. The path that had led them here hadn't been easy, but every challenge, every obstacle, had only served to strengthen their bond. "You know," Dylan said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking about the future, not just ours, but the future we want to create for others." Morgan looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" Dylan's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "Project Renaissance has been such a success. We're changing lives, giving people hope and opportunities they never thought possible. But I think we can do more." He outlined his vision, expanding Project Renaissance beyond the city, creating a network of centers across the country, partnering with other businesses to create job opportunities for those transitioning out of homelessness, lobbying for policy changes to address the root causes of poverty and inequality. As he spoke, Morgan felt her own excitement growing. This was so far beyond the cold, profit-driven businessman she'd first met. This was a man with a mission, a burning desire to make the world better. "It won't be easy," she cautioned, playing devil's advocate even as her mind raced with possibilities. "We'll face opposition, skepticism." Dylan nodded, his expression determined. "I know, but we've faced worse, haven't we? Together I believe we can do anything." Morgan leaned in, kissing him softly. "Together," she agreed, "always." As they made their way back to the reception, both were struck by the impact their story had already had on those around them. They overheard snippets of conversation, friends and colleagues discussing their own philanthropic endeavors, inspired by Dylan and Morgan's example. Jack, the gruff old groundskeeper who had been one of the few to show Morgan kindness in those early days, approached them with tears in his eyes. "You too?" he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "You're doing good, real good. Your dad would be proud, Dylan." Dylan felt a lump form in his throat at the mention of his father. "Thank you, Jack," he managed. "That means more than you know." As the night drew to a close, Dylan and Morgan found themselves once again in the library, where so much of their story had unfolded. They stood by the window, looking out over the grounds where their guests were slowly dispersing. "What a journey it's been," Morgan mused, leaning back against Dylan's chest. "From that first night when I walked into this house, feeling like an intruder, to now." Dylan wrapped his arms around her, his hands coming to rest protectively over her stomach. "Now it's our home," he finished, "our future." They stood in comfortable silence, each lost in their own reflections. Morgan thought about the scared, broken woman she'd been, hardened by life on the streets, afraid to trust or hope. She marveled at the strength she'd found, the purpose she'd discovered, the love she'd never thought she deserved. Dylan's mind wandered to the man he'd been, successful by the world's standards but empty inside, using wealth and power to keep everyone at arm's length. He thought about the walls he'd built around his heart, and how Morgan had slowly but surely dismantled them, showing him a better way to live. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think that vulnerability was a weakness, that letting people in would only lead to pain. But loving you, Morgan, it's made me stronger than I ever thought possible." Morgan turned in his arms, reaching up to cup his face. "That's what real love does," she said. "It doesn't make us weak. It gives us the strength to be our true selves, to fight for what matters." As they sealed this moment with a tender kiss, both felt a profound sense of gratitude for the twisted path that had led them to each other. Every hardship, every setback had been a step towards this moment, this love, this future they were building together. The next morning, as they prepared to leave for their honeymoon, Dylan and Morgan took one last look around the mansion. This place that had once felt like a gilded cage to Morgan, a fortress of solitude to Dylan, now radiated warmth and possibility. "Ready for our next adventure, Mrs. Morissette?" Dylan asked, a playful glint in his eye as he offered her his arm. Morgan laughed, linking her arm through his. "Lead the way, Mr. Morissette. We've got a world to change." As they stepped out into the bright morning sunlight, both felt a sense of limitless potential. Their love story, unconventional as it was, had only just begun. Ahead lay challenges and triumphs, laughter and tears, the everyday magic of a life shared. But more than that, ahead lay the opportunity to make a real difference. To use their love, their resources, their second chance at life to lift others up, to turn their personal happiness into a force for good in the world. As their car pulled away from the mansion, Morgan rested her head on Dylan's shoulder, one hand absently caressing her stomach where their child grew. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think happy endings were just fairy tales, something that happened to other people, not to someone like me." Dylan pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "And now?" Morgan smiled, a smile full of joy and hope and endless possibilities. "Now I know better. Our happy ending is just the beginning." As they drove towards their future, the sun climbing high in the cloudless sky, Dylan and Morgan held tight to each other and to the promise of the life they were building, a life of purpose, of passion, of love without conditions or expiration dates. Their unlikely love story, born from a cruel bet and forged in the fires of adversity, had blossomed into something beautiful and rare, a partnership of equals, a force for change, a testament to the transformative power of love and second chances. And as the Morissette estate faded in the rearview mirror, Dylan and Morgan looked forward with hearts full of hope and a shared vision of a better world, a world they were committed to creating, hand in hand, one day at a time. The end of this chapter was just the beginning of their greatest adventure yet. Together, they were ready to write a new story, not just for themselves, but for all those whose lives they would touch. A story of redemption, of growth, of love, that defies all odds and changes everything it touches. As they embarked on this new journey, Dylan and Morgan carried with them the lessons of their past, the joy of their present, and the boundless hope for their future. Their love, once an unlikely gamble, had become the surest bet of all, a love that would continue to grow, to inspire, and to light the way forward, not just for them, but for all those lucky enough to be touched by their extraordinary story. 5 years had passed since Dylan and Morgan Morissette renewed their vows in the garden of their estate. The warm summer breeze rustled through the leaves of the old oak tree where they now sat, watching their 4-year-old daughter, Lily, chase butterflies across the lawn. Dylan's arm was draped comfortably around Morgan's shoulders, his hand resting on the swell of her stomach where their second child grew. The years had been kind to them both, etching laugh lines around their eyes and a depth of contentment in their expressions that spoke of battles fought and won, of a love that had only grown stronger with time. "Can you believe how far we've come?" Morgan mused, her voice soft with wonder as she watched Lily's golden curls bounce in the sunlight. Dylan chuckled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Sometimes I still think I'm going to wake up and find it was all a dream," he admitted. "But then I look at you, at Lily, at everything we've built together, and I know it's real. All of it." The Renaissance project had flourished beyond their wildest dreams. What had started as a single center in Detroit had blossomed into a nationwide network of support for those struggling with homelessness and poverty. The Morissette model, as it had come to be known, was being studied and replicated in cities across the globe. Just last month, they had attended the opening of the 20th Renaissance Center. As they'd cut the ribbon, surrounded by cheering supporters and grateful beneficiaries, Dylan and Morgan had exchanged a look of pure joy and pride. This was their legacy, the tangible result of their shared vision and tireless work. Morissette Enterprises had undergone a transformation as well. Under their joint leadership, the company had become a beacon of ethical business practices and corporate responsibility. Their innovative profit-sharing model and commitment to community reinvestment had sparked a movement in the business world, proving that it was possible to do well by doing good. "Mommy, Daddy, look what I found." Lily's excited voice broke through their reflections as she ran towards them, her small hands cupped carefully around something. "What is it, sweetheart?" Morgan asked, leaning forward with exaggerated curiosity. Lily opened her hands to reveal a tiny, iridescent beetle. "It's a rainbow bug," she announced proudly. "Can we keep it?" Dylan laughed, ruffling his daughter's hair affectionately. "I think Mr. Rainbow Bug might be happier out here with his family," he said gently. "But why don't we take a picture to remember him by?" As Lily nodded enthusiastically, Morgan couldn't help but marvel at the natural ease with which Dylan had taken to fatherhood. The man who had once viewed emotions as a weakness now freely showered his daughter with affection, his face lighting up with each of her small discoveries and triumphs. Parenthood had changed them both in ways they never could have anticipated. For Morgan, it had been a healing journey, a chance to give her child the love and security she had been denied in her own youth. For Dylan, it had opened up wells of patience and tenderness he never knew he possessed. Later that evening, as they put Lily to bed, Dylan and Morgan found themselves facing an unexpected challenge. A late-night phone call brought news that threatened to upend the carefully balanced life they had built. "That was the board," Dylan said, his face grave as he joined Morgan in their home office. "There's been a hostile takeover attempt. If it succeeds, everything we've worked for with the company and Renaissance could be at risk." Morgan's hand instinctively went to her stomach, her protective instincts flaring. "What are our options?" For the next few hours, they pored over documents, made calls, and strategized. It was reminiscent of those early days when they had worked together to save the company from Arnaldo's embezzlement scheme, but with a crucial difference. Now, they moved in perfect sync, anticipating each other's thoughts, balancing each other's strengths and weaknesses. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, they finally had a plan. It was risky, requiring all of their combined skills, resources, and the goodwill they had built over the years. But as they looked at each other across the desk, both knew it was the right move. "It won't be easy," Dylan said, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "We'll be putting everything on the line." Morgan reached out, taking his hand in hers. "Then it's a good thing we have everything to fight for," she replied, her voice steady and sure. "Together, remember?" Dylan's tired face broke into a smile, his fingers intertwining with hers. "Together," he agreed. "Always." The next few weeks were a blur of activity as they put their plan into action. It was a grueling battle, requiring all of their resources and testing the strength of the relationships they had built over the years. But in the end, their vision and their integrity won out. The takeover attempt was thwarted, and Morissette Enterprises emerged stronger than ever, its mission and values secure. On the evening after their victory was announced, Dylan and Morgan stood on the balcony of their home, looking out over the city they had worked so hard to change for the better. The lights of Detroit twinkled below them, each one representing a life touched by their efforts, a spark of hope in what had once been a landscape of despair. "You know," Dylan said, his arm wrapped securely around Morgan's waist, "when I made that bet all those years ago, I thought I was taking a risk. I had no idea that I was actually making the safest bet of my life." Morgan leaned into him, a soft laugh escaping her lips. "Safe isn't exactly the word I'd use to describe our journey," she teased. Dylan chuckled, turning to face her fully. His eyes, once cold and calculating, now shone with warmth and love as they roamed over her face. "Maybe not," he conceded, "but it brought me you. It brought us Lily and this little one," he said, his hand gently caressing her rounded stomach. "It brought us a purpose bigger than ourselves. I'd say that's the best payoff any bet could have." Morgan's eyes misted over as she cupped Dylan's face in her hands. "Who would have thought," she said softly, "that the girl from the streets and the cold-hearted businessman would end up here, changing the world one life at a time?" "I love you, Morgan Morissette," Dylan whispered, his forehead resting against hers. "More than I ever thought possible." "And I love you, Dylan Morissette," Morgan replied, her voice thick with emotion. "With everything I am." As they sealed their words with a kiss, both felt the weight of their journey, the hardships, the triumphs, the growth, and the love that had transformed not just their lives, but the lives of countless others. Their unlikely love story had become a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of second chances and the transformative nature of true partnership. The soft glow of the city lights enveloped them, a fitting backdrop to the warmth of their embrace. In that moment, standing on the balcony of the home they had built together in every sense, Dylan and Morgan Morissette were more than just a couple. They were a force for change, a love story for the ages, and living proof that sometimes the greatest journeys begin with the most unexpected steps. As they turned to go inside, hand in hand, they carried with them the certainty that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them as they had faced everything else, together, stronger for their bond, and committed to leaving the world a little better than they found it. Their bet on love had paid off in ways neither could have imagined, and the dividends would continue to enrich their lives and the lives of others for years to come. If this story touched you in any way and sparked your curiosity for stories full of emotion and inspiration, don't stop here. Subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and stay up to date with new stories that can transform your outlook on life. Each video is an invitation to explore narratives that resonate in your heart. And speaking of which, how about clicking on the next video? I'm sure it will move you too. See you there.